it's an honor and privilege to welcome Dr. René Gifford, who is going to speak with us today on the evidence for expansion of pediatric cochlear implant candidacies. She is the Fred Bass Chair in Audiology and a professor of hearing and speech sciences and the director of the Cochlear Implant Research Lab at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville. So she has taken time out of her day to give us a talk. So Dr. Gifford, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really my pleasure to be here. I'm going to minimize this so that I don't just see myself. There we go. So thank you again for having me. And so this morning we're going to talk about evidence for the expansion of pediatric cochlear implant candidacy. And here are my disclosures. And my computer was frozen for a moment. Of course, before we go and do anything, I want to acknowledge the entire team. We have just a tremendous team of surgeons, audiologists, speech language pathologists, researchers, students, and none of this, of course, could be possible without this great teamwork. Okay, so before we get into the evidence, I want to just briefly talk about how audiometric criteria for cochlear implantation have evolved over the years for children. So while the clinical trials in the United States started in the mid-'80s for cochlear implants, this did not receive FDA approval until 1990. And at that time, the age requirement was 24 months and older, and the children had to have bilateral profound sensorineural hearing loss. And of course, that was also meaning that they didn't really get any benefit at all from bilateral hearing aids. So really, essentially, a 2-year-old who has really no speech perception with appropriate amplification. About 8 years later, they were lessened a little bit. So with respect to mostly the age criterion. So instead of 2 years and older, it was lowered to 18 months and older, but still bilateral profound. Then in 2000, the age requirement was lowered again to 12 months. And then Cochlear additionally had a slightly different age requirement with respect to the audiometric indications. So all three of the manufacturers had 12 months of age and older with bilateral profound sensorineural hearing loss. Then Cochlear had an additional kind of stipulation that, well, if the child was 2 years and older, so a little bit older, they could have severe to profound sensorineural hearing loss. Well, then from the year 2000, there was really a very long stretch where there was no changes whatsoever to pediatric implant candidacy. Now, in 2019, of course, we all know that that's when we saw, 2019 is when we saw the first SSD indication that was FDA approved. Now, I'm not going to be talking much about SSD or really any today, because we're talking about just general cochlear implant candidacy and then children who might not quite meet that profile. So then in 2020, we saw the age requirement lowered again. So from 12 months down to 9 months and older. Still, for that youngest population, bilateral profound. And then Cochlear did retain that 24 months and older bilateral severe to profound. So what you can see is that really from the year 2000 to 2020, there was absolutely no change whatsoever, despite the fact that adult cochlear implant criteria had evolved quite a bit during that time. So we really are pretty restrictive with respect to indications for cochlear implants in children. So what's the current aided speech recognition criteria? Because of course we know it's not just based on the audiogram. So as it stands today with the current labeled indications, so basically if the child is too young to do behavioral speech perception testing, we're doing most of that based on both the audiogram as well as sort of just auditory skills development based on parental questionnaires. So the child's not meeting developmentally appropriate auditory based milestones. So responding to their name, following simple instructions, and so forth. There are a number of these questionnaires out there. Many of you, I'm sure you're aware of pretty much all of them. So kind of the older ones are more of the meaningful auditory integration scale or the MAZE, and then the infant toddler version of the MAZE, the early speech perception task. And of course, we have many others now that are more commonly used, such as the auditory skills checklist, the little ears questionnaire, and so forth. Now, for older children, it's a little bit more confusing because all three of the companies have slightly different labeled indications. So Advanced Bionics is currently listing less than 12% for monosyllabic word recognition tasks, such as the phonetically balanced kindergarten word list or the PBK. And then they say, well, if you're using sentences, then less than 30% for open sentences. And then they list specifically the hint C, although we tend to use really what's available to us. For Cochlear, it's up to 30% correct for either monosyllabic or multisyllabic words, such as the MLNT or the LNT in the best aided condition. And MED-EL specifies up to 20% on that same measure, so multisyllabic or monosyllabic word recognition tasks. So in other words, children right now, as it stands, if we're going to follow these labeled indications accurately, children really have to miss anywhere from 70 to 88% of the signal in order to officially qualify for a cochlear implant under the current indications. So if we compare that to the adult population and the labeled indications for adults, of course, we all know that the least restrictive of the three manufacturers is up to 60% sentences. And then for Medicare, they just very recently then changed their criteria from under 40% sentences now to 60%. So you can see that, even for example, Advanced Bionics has that sentence recognition requirement. That is cutting that criterion in half from what we require for adults. And most adults getting implants have postlingual onset of deafness. So it's not as if we're trying to give them technologies to allow them to develop speech and language like children. So it is really very restrictive when we kind of really put it all into that perspective. So now, given that, I do believe that that has influenced the number of children who are coming through our clinic who really are not necessarily fitting this exact profile. So what I did is I pulled the data from our pediatric clinical database of children who are coming in for a cochlear implant preoperative eval. Now, the current data shown here we pulled it from 700 children's data that were implanted from 2011 to 2020. Now, I only pulled the children's data who actually then proceeded to go and get a cochlear implant. Of course, we saw more children during that time. Now, of all of the children in our database, 361 of them, so those shown here, had made it to at least the 1-year time point. So that's the audiometric thresholds that we're looking at here. Now, if I just add on the shaded region, so this is kind of severe to profound region. So this would be sort of the least restricted of the criteria for the children and the older children on those labeled indications. What you can see is that really almost all of the children, and in fact, it's about almost 90% of children who are getting a cochlear implant at Vanderbilt actually meet those requirements. So they have bilateral, severe to profound sensorineural hearing loss. So really, we're not getting a lot of those children who are kind of the non-traditional candidates or even really the borderline candidates. Now, a lot of these children up here, I do want to make sure I indicate that the children whose thresholds here appear to be within the normal region, those are children who, of course, were implanted under the SSD criterion. I promise we're not implanting children with bilateral normal hearing. And then a lot of the others in here that were not within that severe to profound are those that are also within that asymmetric criterion. So, of course, the SSD labeled indications specify both single-sided deafness as well as highly asymmetric hearing loss. So really, this is this is in contrast to what we see on the adult side. So for example, on our adult side, we see about anywhere from about 20 to 25% of our new cochlear implant population is actually really kind of meeting what I would say the EAS or the hybrid criteria. So they have very kind of atypical, non-traditional auditory profile for a cochlear implant. Whereas here, we're talking about 10% of our pediatric population. So a lot of these children who are walking around who have these, borderline or just aren't even making progress or the, appropriate progress with their hearing aids are not being referred to a cochlear implant program for preoperative evaluation. So given that, what are the other intervention options for a child who is, not necessarily exactly a cochlear implant candidate with respect to the labeled indications, but who might not be doing as well with conventional amplification? So I'm just going to review those first and then go into the evidence with cochlear implants. So we'll talk about what hearing technology is available to children who are kind of those borderline candidates. Now, I do want to indicate I'm not going to be talking about children with conductive losses or very large conductive components for mixed hearing losses. We're talking about those that definitely have the bilateral severe to profound, the bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. Okay, so the non-invasive interventions, of course, are going to be based on amplification technology. So, of course, with just a conventional amplification, we're talking about just regular old hearing aids, right? So we're providing, frequency-specific gain and providing and making sure that the output in the ear canal is adequate to allow auditory access for most of the speech information for children. Now, the problem with amplification, of course, is that we know that in the literature, we see diminishing benefit from amplification once thresholds reach about 70 dBHL. Now, the reason for this is that once thresholds are reaching that level of severity, we know from a number of histological studies, primarily in, of course, an animal model, that we're talking outer hair cells are essentially gone by that point. And we're starting to see significant damage or complete destruction of inner hair cells by that point. So, of course, a lot of the times we refer to this as a cochlear dead region. But it's a problem because, of course, we know our inner hair cells are our primary sensory transducers. And so even though the underlying neural population in the spiral ganglion might be good, as often is the case for a lot of children, we have no means to get that acoustic information from the cochlea to those primary auditory neurons because those inner hair cells aren't functioning properly. So what that means is that we're going to see very poor access for the auditory speech cues, which are very, very important for development of speech production, language, phonological processing, all of those requisite characteristics that are so critical for a child's development. So this is really a concern of mine, particularly when I see or happen to see an audiogram in our clinic that of a child who's being seen entirely by the hearing aid program. Always kind of want to look over the shoulder and say, oh, that'd be a great child for a referral to come to our cochlear implant program. And unfortunately, they're just not being referred, at least not every single child's coming in. Now, of course, there's another type of amplification that is quite common. And so we're typically referred to as frequency lowering technology, or FLT, comes in a number of different names. Now, there are so many different ways that we can implement frequency lowering technology, but the two most common ones that are used in most of the hearing aids that are out there today are frequency compression and frequency transposition. So what does this mean? So of course, frequency compression, what's happening is those upper channels that are containing that higher frequency speech information are actually being compressed and moved into the lower frequency channels. So as shown here in this figure from Huber and colleagues, we're looking at power in dB along the y-axis, and it's plotted as a function of frequency. And so the original spectrum for this particular speech stimulus, you can see here, is in the dotted line. And so you can see there's considerable information in the higher frequency region. Now, this vertical line represents sort of the cutoff for the frequency compression characteristics, meaning that everything that is appearing above that frequency cutoff is going to be applied with compression. So this solid line then is representing the compressed spectrum. And so what you can see, of course, is everything that's below that cutoff is left untouched, but everything above is just compressed down to increase the likelihood that that will be within the audible region. Now, this has had mixed results. I'm going to review those in just a moment. Another region, in this particular case, I did want to mention that this is an example of nonlinear frequency compression. And why it's nonlinear is that it's not applied to the entire spectrum. You're just taking information above a specific cutoff and you're moving that down. So what that does is it does not maintain those spectral relationships between the different speech regions. For example, it doesn't maintain the relationship between the formant frequencies, which are those large resonant characteristics of speech based on our articulators, our vocal tract, our vocal folds, etc. There is also an example of linear or proportional frequency compression, which isn't really used by any of the current technologies. What that does is if speech information occurs in the very high frequency region, and you can define what region that is, it would take that entire spectrum and compress it down proportionally. And it's just not utilized anymore. It was pretty popular in the late 90s, early 2000s, but it's not utilized now. Other technologies are frequency transposition. And so I'm going to show you this figure here. I know this is probably a bit complicated. I'm just going to walk you through it. This is from Alexander, 2013. Now over here on the left-hand side is just kind of showing a color-based spectrum for speech frequencies, with lower, of course, being here in more of the warm red colors, and then up through the purples, violets, and so forth are the higher frequencies. Now in this example, you can see here, this region here, this is going to be considered inaudible based on this hypothetical patient's audiogram. So first of all, if we look at linear frequency compression, this first schematic here, what you're seeing is that it's taking this entire spectra and it's compressing it down to fit within the audible frequency region for that patient. So that's the first one I had mentioned to you, it proportional or linear, not currently used by today's technology. The next one, of course, is the nonlinear frequency compression, where you're basically just compressing a specific region, but everything below that cutoff is left untouched. Now, the other one is frequency transposition. And this is just basically taking regions of the speech spectra that are in the inaudible region for a particular listener's hearing loss. And all you're doing is simply moving that band into a region that's in the audible range for that listener. So you can see that what you're doing is you're mixing the higher and the lower frequency components with both nonlinear frequency compression and linear frequency transposition. Now, what you can kind of think of this, so Pam Souza, who is an auditory scientist and specializes in hearing aid research, she's mentioned that this is frequency lowering technology is sort of, you're looking at a trade-off between improved audibility for those high frequency stimuli, but it also provides distortion of the incoming speech spectra. And this can be heavily dependent on the listener's actual audiometric characteristics. So as you can imagine, because we're introducing distortion, the outcomes with this technology are really all over the place. So I'm going to show you some examples of, here are some papers that have looked at frequency lowering technologies and have shown significant benefit from this technology. So we know that this technology absolutely provides better audibility or detection of speech stimuli that occur in the higher frequency range, because now they're pulled down into the audible range for that listener. We also know that both frequency compression, nonlinear frequency compression, and frequency transposition, they all provide better perception of plurality. So for example, if you do a test of plurals, dog, dogs, cat, cats, when you have any of these frequency lowering technologies in play, children are going to do better when they have that. Speech production, specifically of S and Z, is significantly better with frequency lowering technology, as well as speech and phoneme perception in some conditions. Not all of the conditions test it. And in one study out of Australia, they did find slightly improved receptive and expressive language for children wearing bilateral hearing aids who were using frequency lowering technology as compared to just standard conventional amplification. But for every paper that has shown a benefit, there's papers that have shown absolutely no benefit at all. So in fact, in looking at consonant perception, there are a number of studies, and these are specifically just those that have looked in children. Of course, there's an entire literature base that also looks in adults that actually tends to mirror what we see here in the children as well. Consonant perception, no benefit whatsoever from frequency lowering technology. And you can kind of imagine that that would be the case because it's introducing distortion. And we have to have good access to the spectral characteristics of those consonants to be able to correctly identify them. Vowel perception, no benefit in children. And in fact, there are studies in adults that have shown that vowel perception can actually get worse with this technology because, again, it's adding distortion and vowels are coded entirely on the basis of the incoming spectrum. Parental reports of audibility, responsiveness, speech understanding, no difference with frequency lowering technology, no difference in speech production in this particular paper, even though there was another paper that did show an improvement. Ching and colleagues also showed no improvement in just overall global language or receptive vocabulary. And in this particular paper, Glista and colleagues in 2019, not only did they show no difference in sound quality ratings between just conventional amplification and frequency lowering amplification, in some of the children, they actually showed that they rated the sound quality poor with the frequency lowering as compared to the standard amplification. So there's really limited evidence that suggests that frequency lowering technology is going to be sufficient to allow high levels of speech understanding, language, speech production in a group of children with bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. And I'm not going to spend much more time on this, but I do, if you're interested in this, there are these two systematic reviews that have looked at the outcomes in children using this frequency lowering technologies. And the bottom line is they're saying, there's really not a lot of evidence to say that this is effective. And unfortunately, the studies in this space have been pretty low quality as well. So Why this is important is that every single hearing aid that right now that we're using at Vanderbilt, and probably most centers, I would suspect also at House, uses frequency lowering technology. And in fact, in many of the softwares for these hearing aids, it's considered the default. You have to physically go in and turn it off, despite the fact that there's no evidence whatsoever that it provides, global improvement on a number of measures. So, of course, that's concerning to me, but it's not going to be sufficient to provide high levels of auditory access for children who are developing speech and language and academics and socialization, et cetera. So the next thing we want to think about for children who are these kind of non-traditional cochlear implant candidates or borderline candidates is, well, let's start maybe with a combination of electric and acoustic hearing, or as we often call bimodal hearing, combining a hearing aid on one side with a cochlear implant on the other. And of course, we all know there's considerable evidence. Actually, at this point, substantial evidence to show that bimodal hearing provides significant benefit in a number of different listening environments. Now, specifically to children with sensorineural hearing loss, there's substantial benefit to be had. So in terms of speech perception and quiet and noise in these studies, phonological processing. So phonological processing, that's describing our use of the sounds in our language, so just like the phonemes, to process both the auditory spoken word as well as the written word. So for example, we all use phonological processing every day when we see a word that we don't immediately recognize. So remember, first, second grade, and we didn't know how to say a word, our teacher or our parent would say, sound it out. That's a perfect example of what phonological processing is. And having access to acoustic hearing combined with electric provides superior phonological processing. And that kind of makes sense if you think about, because we know that the spectral resolving capabilities of acoustic hearing are superior to what we can get with electrical hearing. So you combine those two together and we can see substantially improved phonological processing, which of course is a precursor to literacy. Lexical tone perception. So of course, in lexical tone languages, Mandarin, Cantonese, others, substantially improved perception of those speech tokens as compared to just electric only. As well as suprasegmental perception. So suprasegmental perception is the ability to resolve those slight changes maybe in our voice pitch, so the fundamental frequency of our voice, our rising inflection, changes in our overall tone. So this is what provides information, not necessarily about the linguistics of the speech, but emotion, stress, all different types of things, prosody, right? So these are things that are very important. So for example, we all know that individuals with hearing loss struggle with things. Was that individual angry? Were they being sarcastic? Those types of nuances of speech, which are really important for, our social communication experiences. So bimodal stimulation, good. It provides benefits in all of these areas. So now, what about just overall evidence in the peer-reviewed literature for the expansion of pediatric indications? There's considerable evidence. So I'm going to move this down. First, I'm going to start with a paper that was, or a study that was led by Matt Carlson and colleagues. So this is when Matt was a neurology fellow at Vanderbilt, so many years ago now. And what we did was we looked at our entire pediatric cochlear implant database, and we wanted to pull out children who were implanted under 18 years of age who had bilateral sensorineural hearing loss and who had met either one or both of the following criteria. So basically what we looked at the time was what were the current labeled indications for cochlear implantation on the basis of the audiogram and as well as aided speech perception. So at that time, the audiometric indications, which actually is still the case today, were severe to profound for children 2 years of age and older, or profound or worse for children who are under 2 years. So basically what we did was we just looked for children who got a cochlear implant at our center who actually were better than those labeled indications. So if they were 2 to 17, their PTA or pure tone average was better than 70. And if they were under 2 years when they got the implant, their PTA was better than 90 dBHL. Then what we looked at was we looked at speech and word recognition using an age-appropriate measure. So of course, it's going to depend on the age and developmental status of the child. But again, the least restrictive of the labeled indications for children are 30% or or poorer for monosyllabic word recognition, and that happens to be Cochlear's indication. So basically, we just said, okay, we want to look for children who were implanted, and if they had speech perception done preoperatively, they had to score better than 30%. All right, so of course, because we're looking across a pretty broad range of ages for this population, we had to look across a number of different developmentally appropriate speech perception tasks. So while all of the children in this study may have had slightly different measures that had been administered, we did ensure that every child had had the exact same measure administered both pre and post-operatively. And we had speech recognition tests from the ear that was implanted, the contralateral ear alone, as well as the bilateral best aided condition. Of course, a large number of speech recognition assessments is shown here. And then, of course, for the children that were too young to participate in behavioral speech perception, we still wanted to include their data, but we included it only if they had had parental auditory questionnaires administered, both pre and post-operatively, and it was the same auditory questionnaire so that we could kind of have an apples to apples comparison. And the three measures were the IT maze and the maze, little ears, and peach at that time. Because this was kind of an older data set, we didn't have a lot of children for whom we had administered the auditory skills checklist, although that's our go-to these days. All right, so what did we find? So we were able to identify 51 children in our database, and this was 51 children across 2 centers, so at Vanderbilt as well as Mayo Clinic. Of course, as you would imagine, because these are sort of non-traditional cochlear implant candidates, the majority of these children were getting a single implant utilizing a bimodal hearing configuration, but 12 of the children in this sample also had received bilateral implants. The age at implantation of this particular population was over 8 years. And the reason, of course, is that these children were not the typical candidates for implants. So they weren't being referred in the ranges of the ages that would be most critical to get a cochlear implant. But in this particular sample, we saw children anywhere from 7 months of age up to almost 18. At the time of their post-operative speech recognition that we recorded here for the study, the mean age of CI experience, or the mean duration, was about 17 months. And we had representation of all 3 of the manufacturers of AB, Cochlear, and Med-El. All right, what we're seeing here is the basically what the underlying etiologies were for this particular sample. And as is often the case, the largest proportion was unknown, and you can see the others there. We've got EVA, meningitis, thought to be familial. Not all of them had genetic testing to confirm that. Of course, connexin, Usher, and so forth. On the right-hand side, what I've plotted are the mean thresholds, audiometric thresholds for the ear that was implanted, or the non-implanted ear for the bimodal, or the better hearing ear for those children who got bilateral implants. And what you can see is that a large proportion of this sample, even though these are mean data, you confer this, a large proportion of the sample had asymmetry in their thresholds across the ears. And in fact, it was that asymmetry that the parents had mentioned to us, because I happen to follow a lot of these children clinically, that a lot of these children were told by other centers or the hearing aid audiologists that, sorry, you don't meet qualifications in both ears, so you just can't, you can't get a cochlear implant, which of course we know is not the case, but that was kind of the limiting factor in a lot of these children's hearing journey. All right, so how about the data? So what I'm showing you here are speech perception scores pre-operatively, post-operatively for the CI alone on the left-hand side, as well as the bimodal configuration or bilateral for that small proportion who got 2 implants. So we have percent correct, of course, on the y-axis. Now, each one of these gray lines represents an individual child, and of course, the bold dashed line represents the mean. So let's focus first on the ear that was implanted. Now, first of all, what we see is that every single child in this sample showed improvement in the ear that was implanted. It's such a rarity in auditory research to see every single person in a population show improvement. So this is pretty dramatic. And in fact, it was a huge improvement at the group level, about a 63 percentage point improvement on average. So this is highly successful intervention. Now, if we look in the bilateral best aided condition, of course, many of these children had much less room to improve, right? Because some of these kids, because of the degree of asymmetry, Even though they still had sensorineural hearing loss in the non-implanted ear, they were performing really well on measures of speech recognition, particularly in quiet. So they kind of were just right up there at the ceiling, didn't really have much room to improve. But same thing, every single child in the sample did show either equivocal or improvement in the best aided condition. And at the group level, the performance improvement was about 40 percentage points. So of course, you could assume that this was a highly significant effect in both of those. Now, what about auditory development? So remember, there was a small proportion of that sample for which the children were too young to participate in behavioral speech perception at the postoperative time point. So all we had was kind of pre and post, whether it be little ears, ITMAs, peach, et cetera. And so what we simply did was, for example, in the little ears, there's 35 questions. And let's say they got, half of those correct, or if they met half of the developmental milestones preoperatively, they met all of them postoperatively, we would call that 50%, 100%. So we just transformed it into a score. And so again, for these children, you can see every single child either showed equivocal or improvement in their performance on auditory skills based on this parental questionnaire. And at the group level, it was a statistically significant improvement of nearly 30 percentage points. So really, there is just no evidence from this particular study that children who might not meet exactly the criteria for cochlear implantation, that they're going to get substantial benefit from this intervention. So of course, we know, we all know this, and I know that House is, of course, very progressive institution, and you've been doing this for decades. But of course, we all know that our peers in a number of institutions just absolutely aren't implanting these children, or they're not even referring these children on for evaluation. So on the basis of this particular study, we basically concluded that, of course, if children aren't making year for year progress on auditory skills development, language, speech production, despite the fact that their audiogram might not fit the profile that's listed in the labeled indications, they should absolutely be referred for a cochlear implant, because they stand to gain tremendous improvement with that intervention as compared to just their standard amplification, whether it be conventional, just frequency specific amplification, or even if it includes frequency lowering technology. So I want to take us to a slightly different study for a moment. So this study, Lee and colleagues, it came from the Australian group in Melbourne, and they were using actually a retrospective analysis, but it was these data that were collected prospectively. So at Melbourne, of course, they have a auditory oral school that's kind of on site, very similar to a lot of centers. And of those children, they were able to get 140 children who had been implanted early and who had been enrolled in an auditory, oral, or listening and spoken language program. So all of the children in the study had bilateral severe to profound, bilateral sensory neural hearing loss and didn't have any additional disabilities or comorbidities. 78 of the children in that sample had received at least one cochlear implant, and all of them were implanted under 2.5 years of age. The other children in the sample, 62 of them were bilateral hearing aid users, and all again had been fitted under 2.5 years of age. So we're looking at, children who basically were identified early, and even though it says under 2.5, most of the children in the sample were fitted with this technology very, very early in the first few months of life. The primary outcome measure in this particular study was monosyllabic word recognition at school entry in Australia, which is approximately equivalent to what we would be at, entering kindergarten. And the average child in this particular study then would have been around 5 years of age at the time that they measured the word recognition. Okay, so what we're looking on this particular figure is percent correct for open set words, that OSW. So that's what's represented here. We have OSWPH, which is the phonemes, and of course, W would be words. Now, there are different participant groups here along the x-axis. We have the 3 groups of hearing aid users. So the hearing aid users whose underlying audiometric configuration was of a moderate sense severity, a severe severity, or profound across the spectrum. And then over here on the right are the children who got at least one cochlear implant. Now, of course, I do want to point out potential limitations is that we're taking already a smaller sample of children using hearing aids, and then we're breaking them down into 3 individual categories, which then further decreases the sample size. So I just want to point that out. But if you look at their scores at about 5 years of age across all of these groups, what they found was the group of children with hearing aids that had moderate hearing losses and the group of children who got at least one cochlear implant, they were not significantly different in terms of their speech perception at about 5 years of age. But the other two hearing aid categories, so children who had severe losses, as well as children who had profound losses, but who were only using hearing aids, they performed significantly poorer than the other two groups at school entry. So on this basis, what they then wanted to do was take all of these children's data and look at them individually. So that's what this figure is. So we're looking at percent correct on the y-axis, plotted as a function of the 3 frequency pure tone average. So that's 500, 1,000, and 2,000. And so all of these dots represent an individual child who is utilizing bilateral hearing aids. So none of the children with cochlear implants, their symbols are not on here. How they're represented, however, is this dashed horizontal line. And this represents the first quartile for those 78 children who had at least one cochlear implant. Okay, so that means that 75% of the pediatric CI sample here performed above that particular score, which happened to be 73%. Okay, so then what they did was they took this particular this distribution of children and they fit it to a curve fit. And so what we're looking at is a quadratic regression, of course, so it's just a nonlinear regression fit. Then what they did was they looked at the point at which that quadratic regression intersected that first quartile of the children's speech perception scores, the children who had implants. And then what they found was that that corresponded to a 60 dB HL PTA. So what they inferred from this is that for children who have a PTA that's higher or worse than 60 dB HL, that we would expect that about 75% of those children at a group level would do better with a cochlear implant as combined or compared to just bilateral hearing aids. So interestingly, this would put pediatric indications much closer on par to what we would see for the adult cochlear implant indications. So what they recommended on the basis of this study was that children who have a pure tone average of 65 dBHL or worse have a much higher statistical likelihood of deriving significant improvement with a cochlear implant as compared to their bilateral hearing aid condition. And as I indicated, this would put us much closer to adult indications as labeled in the US. So on the basis of those two previous studies, so there's the Carlson et al. And now this Lee et al. Paper, what my colleague Christine Brown and I did a couple of years ago is we just basically wanted to expand the study of the Carlson paper and take in, and because from that time that we completed that, we were starting to see more children coming through the door that were a little bit more, borderline or non-traditional candidates. So we identified 79 children, so 79 unique children, so that were not included in the Carlson paper. And of course, we used the exact same inclusion criteria that Carlson had used. We excluded children who had auditory neuropathy, cochlear nerve deficiency, or single-sided deafness, just like the Carlson paper. And then the mean experience at the postoperative time points was just over 12 months. And so basically we compared pre and post-operative speech recognition on a number of measures. Okay, so if we look here, these are the data for, I'm going to show 3 figures. These are CI only, so the CI ear. We're looking at word recognition. And so again, the child might have been participating in monosyllabic word recognition if they were old enough or of the developmental status to perform that particular task, or they might have been using a multisyllabic lexical neighborhood test, so a slightly younger child. So for example, multisyllabic would be something like banana, monkey, and the monosyllabic would be juice. So those are those types of words from those tasks. Okay, so what we're looking on this figure is that along the x-axis, we have their scores for the preoperative time point, their first postoperative time point that we measured speech recognition, often usually in the 1 to 3 month region, And then just for the purposes of this retrospective study, we then took the very last postoperative score that was in the electronic health record for each child. And of course, that ranged anywhere from, the average was about 12 months, but it could have been 9 months, it could have been 2 or 3 years. So what you can see here, of course, just like the Carlson paper, every individual line here represents an individual child. And then the bold here are the means with ±1 standard deviation. And so you can see, of course, we see highly significant improvement on measures of word recognition, even early on in the cochlear implant experience. So even like 1 to 3 months, these children have just shown tremendous improvement. And also, if you look at the most recent time point, nobody got worse. There was just a couple of kids who we saw a slight decrement early on in just that year, but then by about the 1 year point, we see that improvement that was pretty dramatic. So just like the Carlson paper, we don't have any evidence of any of these children showing a decrement. So we did no harm by offering this technology to this group. And of course, as you can see from these statistics here, it was a highly significant improvement. Here are for sentences in the implanted ear, and this is sentences in quiet. So again, because we're dealing with a population of children here, you can see that the number of children who had pre and postoperative sentences is much smaller than words. Of course, sentences, children tend to struggle with this type of measure until they get to an age, usually at least kindergarten, first grade, where their auditory working memory really allows them to kind of follow that entire sentence and then, compile that information and then repeat it back. But for this group of children, same thing. No one got worse. Everyone showed either equivocal or pretty substantial improvement. And at the group level, we see a highly significant improvement in this group of children. How about sentences and noise? The sample gets even smaller. But it's sort of the same thing. We see everybody is showing either equivocal, really few show equivocal here. Pretty much everyone is showing pretty substantial improvement. And again, it was found to be statistically significant. So what about the bilateral ADIC condition? And so again, this is most of the children in this particular study, and I mean the overwhelming majority, were using a bimodal hearing configuration because again, they have these non-traditional losses. So what we're looking at, but we say bilateral ADIC because some of the children did have bilateral implants, and so we didn't want to just characterize it as bimodal. So we're looking at word recognition again here. And in the best ADIC condition, things look a little different because some of the kids were starting at like 100% because they have this asymmetry and they were really getting all of their performance on the basis of just that one better hearing ear. But even the children here who might have shown a slight decrement, by the time they got to the 1 year point on average, they were performing about the same. And in fact, the decrement that we see on those that did show a slight decrease would not be considered individually statistically significant. What I mean by that is if we looked at kind of a binomial distribution of test-retest variability for a given measure, that child would have been within the test-retest variability. So meaning like maybe, they just weren't paying attention. And so we expect some degree of that variability. But again, at the group level, this was found to be statistically significant. Moving on. And here we have bilaterally aided, same thing. Now the problem with this is sentence recognition in quiet, and a lot of these kids were already topped out. It's a great problem to have, but we're really struggling to always find the best sentence recognition measure for children. I think many of you are probably familiar with like the AZ biosentences for adults. We have the pediatric equivalent of that, which is called the pediatric AZ bio, or often termed the baby bio, which is kind of just like the nickname. Great concept. However, even though I was involved in that, most of the children that I follow in the clinic, and absolutely most of them in the lab, they're getting 100% on this measure. So we're at a point again where we need to potentially develop a new speech recognition measure for children with implants because they're doing just so well. Again, another great problem to have. This is for sentences and noise, and things are a little bit more all over the place. And actually at the group level, we did not see that it was statistically significant. And I believe it's primarily due to the fact of these 2 children here who showed a decrement. Now, I'm really a stickler about removing data, so we didn't remove these children's data from our particular study. But I do want to explain that those two children had actually shown a progression of the hearing loss in the ear that was not implanted. And they actually, at this point, had both progressed. At this point now, not when we published the data, they've gotten a second implant for that reason. So I didn't want to throw it out, but I do want to just make that point that we didn't make anybody worse by simply implanting them. There were some other factors at play. So to start to finish things out, I do want to provide just one case study that I think is a great study because it looks at kind of the holistic view of a child's auditory, speech, language, academic, socialization profile in determining whether or not the child would develop or would derive improvement following cochlear implantation. So this was a 4.5-year-old girl that was basically self-referred to me. So she had been self-referred by the parents, that is. She had term birth, no complications, no family history of hearing loss. She actually passed her newborn hearing screening, so parents had no concerns whatsoever. But they noticed that both parents are professionals and working full-time. And so she was in a preschool environment or daycare preschool environment. And what they started to notice was that around the time she was about 2, she was starting to retreat from playing with the other children in the preschool. Her teachers were saying, she's just not as social. Parents were starting to get concerned. Maybe there were other issues, maybe potentially onset of autism. But that wasn't the case. In fact, at 3 years of age, after these concerning months leading up to this, she was diagnosed with severe to profound sensorineural hearing loss in the higher frequencies with the underlying etiology of TMPRSS3. Now, her parents were just fantastic, fitted her with hearing aids, like really essentially immediately. They purchased a home FM system. They were driving her to an auditory verbal therapist twice a week. It was a 1-hour drive, 1 hour one way and back. So they were doing this twice a week. I mean, these are kind of like the ideal parents for, pediatric audiologist or otologist. Their home audiologist and their home ENT both told them she just has too much hearing for a cochlear implant. And this was her audiometric configuration. So this is very atypical, right? This is not the typical audiogram that we see for a 4-year-old. You see a lot of adults with this audiogram, but not typically for children. So what you can see is that if you looked at, because of her age, the indications would be bilateral severe to profound. I would argue she absolutely meets indications because the majority of her audiometric thresholds are within that shaded region. But I would still want to look at her aided speech perception as well as her overall profile for language, speech production, et cetera. So here's where she was when she came in. So I do want to just backtrack a moment. So after parents were seeing really not a lot of progress, with this twice a week ABT, all of the technology that they were utilizing, she really wasn't making many gains, and her socialization skills were not improving. So this was a child who she had a lot of behavioral issues because she really didn't have a lot of friends and wasn't able, her friends in preschool and daycare, they really weren't able to understand her speech. So mom just happened to start Googling, like where can we find, and she happened to find a paper that we had published with adults who had very similar audiograms. And so she just reached out and said, hey, is there anything you can do for us? And I was like, well, how soon can you get here? And so what we've got here is we've got lexical neighborhood tests, or these are monosyllabic word recognition tasks in her left aided and her right aided. I didn't test the bilateral condition because we did a ton of tests at her preoperative eval. So interestingly, she actually did meet labeled indications for cochlear implantation because she scored under 30% word recognition. So this is a great reminder that we can't just look at the audiogram. And so here were her sentence recognition scores. And even still, she met criteria for a cochlear implant because she scored 30% or worse in sentences. Now, how was her language? So our speech language pathologist had administered the preschool language scale. And so what I've put here, this is a standard score. So very similar to IQ test or any other test that's normalized to the large population. So of course, the average for one's age would be 100, and then plus minus 1 standard deviation would be 15 points. So really anybody scoring 85 or above would be considered age normative. So what you can see is that for the preschool language scale, as well as this test of articulation or her speech production, the Goldman-Fristow test, she was basically one or more standard deviations below average. And so I want to just kind of play an example of her speech her speech production, just so you can get an idea of her intelligibility.
Sarah has 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5, and 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
So I want to point out specifically the way she says 6 and 7. You can tell that she's in auditory verbal therapy. She really over enunciates, trying to be 6, 7, but you can't produce a sound that you can't hear. So she's not able to accurately, have that fricative sound. Now, I do want to play another sample of her just kind of talking about things in her life. And so see if you can understand her.
My daddy don't have one of those trucks anymore. That there was that street. He had two seats.
Okay, so I happen to know exactly what she's saying. So I don't know how many of you followed that. So she was saying, my daddy doesn't have that truck anymore because that truck only had 2 seats because, she has siblings. And so daddy had to get rid of the truck because it didn't fit the whole family. So you can see she's, she's struggling with speech production. Now, what's really important here is that her nonverbal IQ is above average, 121. So she's well above average on that. But if you look at her verbal IQ, she's at 88. So she's right on that borderline of kind of that normal to below average range. So she has the cognitive capacity to be performing within the age normative range on these measures, but her auditory characteristics are limiting her. So I also want to just quickly show her scores on this quick interactive language screener, or the QUILS. This is a great measure. We use it in my lab. It's a quick automated assessment of a child's language. So for example, you might see things like looking at prepositional phrases like find the kitten in the cup with the yellow ribbon. And then the child just has to touch on the touch screen. Okay, so what we have is this is the QUILS % correct, and we have all of these different categories. This is her score here, and this is where she should be on all of these measures based on her age. So you can see she's definitely below where we would expect. So she got a cochlear implant in the right ear literally a month after her workup, because we were just like, this has to happen. She's 4.5 years of age. She's missed all of this time. What we have here's her preoperative audiogram in that ear. Here's her postoperative audiogram. So she has tremendous, hearing preservation. And now with her implant, she has auditory access to these higher frequency regions. By 6 months of age, you can see that she's lost a little bit more hearing at 500 hertz, but still has basically has normal hearing perception in the very low frequency region. Now, before I show you her scores, I can tell you she was doing so well in those first few months that her parents are like, let's do that other ear. Now, they also knew that with her etiology that she would be experiencing progressive losses. I think someone's microphone is on. So we knew that she would ultimately have progressive loss with that underlying etiology. So she got a second implant in the left ear. She had 522s. And there was her right ear at 6 months, and that is her left ear pre-op and her left ear post-op at 3 months. So this is where I'm going to show you the scores, and then we'll wrap it up. So we've got % correct for words and baby bio sentences, and this was pre-op. Here's where she was at 6 months for the right ear. So you can see tremendous, highly significant improvement, both on words and even more so on sentences where there's context. Now, left ear alone, again, now the left ear at this point, she had only had 3 months experience with the left ear, but she showed about the same benefit on that side as compared to the right. Now, if we look bilaterally on these measures, she's just performing tremendously. So with words, she's above 80%, sentences and quiet, same thing. And while we didn't test her on sentences and noise pre-op because she was already basically at the floor, We did test her at the 6-month point, and she's scoring at 60% with just, again, 6 months experience on one side, 3 months on the other. Now, this is where she was preoperatively on these norm referenced assessments. Now, these norm referenced assessments are designed to be administered annually. So we didn't administer all of these, but her speech production had improved so dramatically that we did re-administer the Goldman-Fristow. And you can see that by 6 months of use, she went from almost, honestly, one of the lowest scores that you can actually score on the Goldman-Fristow to now just about at that lower, 1 standard deviation below where we would expect her to be based on her age, her chronological age. Now, we did, at the 1-year point, did re-administer everything. And this is where her scores were for the language, the preschool language scale, and this is where she was on that test of articulation. So within 1 year, she's now within the age appropriate range. So I want to remind you what she sounded like when she was counting to 10.
So I had 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5, and 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
So that was before, and this is where she was at 6 months of device use.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
So you can see still not perfect, but she's saying 6, 7. So she's able to articulate that S sound. Now, just quickly, because for the sake of time, I'm going to show you this is where she was on the quill. So that quick interactive language screener. So with just 6 months of device use, she's now achieving kind of age appropriate range on a number of these characteristics, not all of them, but tremendous benefit. And most recent appointment. So I saw her last summer, and basically this is where she's scoring now. So she's now at adult CNC word rec. She's basically close to 100% on all of those. And I have to now test her at a 0 dB signal to noise ratio in sentences because she gets 100% even at +5. So just tremendous improvement for this child. So really, we know the current criteria for children are just so restrictive in terms of the audiogram, aided speech perception, and maybe even age, because recall, not all of the manufacturers have a under 12 months of age labeled indication. We know that these indications completely unchanged for 20 years. They really only lowered the age at this point from 12 months to 9 months. And pediatric indications are even more stringent than adults. They require children to miss 70 to 88% of the signal, and that's in a quiet sound booth. And we know a child's environment is anything but quiet. So the recommendation, of course, is we want to think beyond the audiogram. We want to look at the holistic, auditory, speech, language, socialization, academic profile for a given child. And what I really encourage us to start talking about cochlear implants the minute we see that a child is identified with hearing loss. They might not be a candidate at that point, but it's a hearing healthcare continuum. We don't want parents to feel like if they get to a cochlear implant, they've failed. It's not a failure. It's actually just one step in that journey. So we want to start that conversation early, and we really want to encourage our peers to start referring these children for a cochlear implant eval when they start to get to a pure tone average of about 65 dBHL based on Lee and colleagues.